Over the years, I've collected a good amount of art supplies, and when I get new ones, sometimes the old ones don't get used as much. In fact, a lot of these have just started to collect dust because it's been a good 2 to 3 years since I last used them. But today, that's gonna change. So hi everyone, I'm Ward, and welcome to my channel, Wardrawsalot. Today, we're gonna be using all the older art supplies that sit on my shelf begging to be touched. So, let's go through what I have here. First off, we have the Spectrum Noir markers. They have like a black outer color along with 2 grips on both sides. One side is a chisel nib and the other side is a bullet nib, and the bullet nib side is marked with like a gray outline so you could tell the difference when you pick up the marker. Next, we have our little bunch of liners. First, we have our Prismacolor Premier liners that come in a bunch of different colors and sizes. The next liner that I have is actually my oldest art supply, I think, which are my liners from high school. So these are the Sakura Pigma Senseis, and they have been with me for like at least 10 years now, I'm gonna say. The little bunch also had like 2 mechanical pencils, but I forgot to show those. There's this mound of Sharpies that I bought like over a year ago and just haven't touched ever since. Finally, this pack of Prismacolor Premier colored pencils, which I barely ever touch. So, of course, after I look at all my art supplies, I go ahead and draw up a character in my sketchbook, but I also do a tester page. Now, the whole point of the tester page is to test these older art supplies, just so when I'm actually coloring in my drawing, I don't get any nice little surprises along the way. The first thing I test were the Sakura Pigma Sensei liners, and they came in 0.3, 0.4, 0.6, and 1.0. Most of which were still good on ink, except the 0.3, that one was starting to dry out. After that, I did the Prismacolor Premier liners, and majority of them worked actually pretty well. All the colored liners were in 0.5, and I had a 0.3 in black and a 0.8 in black. Again, the 0.3 was starting to dry out too. Next, I wanted to test the Spectrum Noir markers. Now, I do have these old swatch sheets from a few years ago when I had first gotten the markers, which is good because now I could just go ahead and pick from the colors that I want from this page because I don't remember what they look like right off the bat. So for each section of the character that I'm going to draw, I go ahead and test out those markers. First off, we start with the skin tones, and there was one at the top which was FS2, which was drying out, and I didn't have the refill. I didn't get to buy any of the refills for these markers because by that point, I had already gotten my Copics, so I kind of abandoned the Spectrum Noirs, and yeah, so those for the skin tones, there's that part. Some shading, which would be the IV3, PL1. I also did the hair on the bottom, which I ended up taking a huge pause on because I found this marker right here. Now, the markers, I'm guessing like ink just kind of curled up at the tip of the marker and then grew a backrooms entity attached to it, so it was just this huge clump of gunk that just sat on the marker. So I took it to a separate piece of paper and then tried to scrape off all the gunk that was on it, so this way if I was going to use it, it wouldn't end up on the drawing. But even after cleaning the gunk off, I was kind of iffy about using it on the drawing because I didn't want random gunk clumps to appear everywhere. Mind you, this isn't only Spectrum Noir that this problem happens with. It can be with any marker because ink over time sits on the marker and then just hardens and then can eventually form like those little clumps. So it's not just Spectrum Noir, it literally can be Copics too, just anything that involves ink because it's pooling over time. So after testing all my art supplies and having everything in front of me that I needed, I was super excited to color in this drawing because I really liked the way it came out, but something happened. Good news, I finished the piece. Horrible news, I wasn't recording the entire time. So, I guess part 2, because why not? Yeah, baby, you heard it here first. Apparently, I forgot to press the fucking record button. And I ended up having to do a second piece as a result. So, later that night, and I'm talking about later that night, like at 4 a.m., I did this sketch that I got from a reference, especially because I was really struggling hard with what to pose the character in, especially because I wanted to keep the whole book thing involved, and just continued on from there. On the bright side, I did get to use another old art supply, or one that I just don't use as much, which is my Nina cardstock. That was, in fact, the only paper that I used to use besides Bristol board, but once I realized how expensive Bristol board was and how I couldn't keep buying it, I was like, okay, what's a good alternative? And Nina cardstock was a fantastic alternative. I think they rebranded it to like Bright cardstock or something. I don't know, it's like a new name. If I could find it, I'll put it up on the screen, but if I can't, I don't know. But they rebranded it into a different one, and cardstock blends alcohol markers really good, so I highly suggest that. I didn't know at first what to use, and then when I did my research, I found cardstock, and I love it. I still love cardstock. It's just that now I use sketchbooks that are kind of suited for markers instead, which make it much easier to keep all my artwork in one place, because I have all my old drawings in like this yellow manila folder, and they sit in there, and I just, even though it's there and it's like accessible for myself to like see at any time, I just like everything in a sketchbook instead, where it's all put together and doesn't fall out all over the floor, because that happens to me very often. So yeah, Nina's cardstock is great, or any cardstock truly is great, but I just prefer the sketchbooks now. Now, the one thing that I did use was my Prismacolor Col Erase. I still use that actually very often with my art now, but I didn't want to use a regular mechanical pencil for the sketch of the drawing, because I didn't want like grayish or like messy undertones under the markers, and I didn't want that to blend out. So I decided to opt out of using mechanical pencils for the sketch and just go ahead and use the Prismacolor Col Erase, because I didn't want the drawing to look a little grimy or like dirty or, you know, like messy. So I was like, okay, we'll just use the Prismacolor Col Erase, because I feel like that would be a good decision for the drawing. Okay, so now we could talk about the art supplies a little bit more. The Spectrum Noir markers were, I think, one of my first brand name markers. Before that, I had these old markers called Cell Colors from Amazon that I had bought, and they're like, man, they're like really old markers, and I don't have them anymore because I sold them. If I had older stuff that like I needed to fund towards my newer stuff, a lot of the time I would sell them off, because I told myself maybe somebody else could use them to their fullest, because, you know, I'm not using them. I remember when I got these, I was in search for like a cheaper alternative to Copics, because I couldn't afford them at the time. So I went to the Spectrum Noir website, and if you know Spectrum Noir, they always have a sale, and they're usually really good sales. So I got these markers at least 50% off of the original price, and I was like, hell yeah. I was like, of course I'm going to buy them 50% off the original price. So I ended up getting like 70 markers for, I think, like $120, $130, something around that range. And I got, I think, every marker they had in the line. But I did end up getting the chisel nib and the bullet tip ones, because I couldn't afford the brush nib ones. Plus, at that time, the brush nibs didn't have a large variety in the color range as the chisel ones did. So I was like, okay, I'll end up getting more colors, but no brush nib, which is okay with me, because I like a large variety of colors, because I like blending back and forth with them. Plus, I don't need brush tips to blend. Yes, they do give a softer blend, but realistically, you can blend with a bullet tip or a chisel nib, and again, of course, the brush nib. As long as you just practice enough, you'll get smooth gradients and know what you're doing. I did use my Spectrum Noir markers a lot, like for a long while before I switched over to my Copics, and I got a lot of use out of them. That's why I think the FS2 was kind of dry, because I remember using that marker a lot to practice with, and these markers were there with me for like a lot of trial and error in art style and in the way I color and in everything. So I really like almost have a sentimental connection with these markers, which is why I don't want to sell them, especially because they were kind of gifted to me too by like my mom. She helped me get these markers because she believed that I could draw and use them to the fullest extent. So thanks, mama. So there's also that. I think the one thing that I truly didn't like about the Spectrum Noir markers was that the color range wasn't like very refined. There weren't many like really lighter tones or differences in a lot of the tones that they already had. Like a lot of the reds that I had on my old swatchy for a majority of the part looked very samey, so I was like, what's the difference between a lot of these markers? And I remember going through that issue a lot, and I was like, man, I can't wait to get even better markers, so then this way I can color with nice gradients and smooth blending and all that stuff. But I told myself until I get way better at coloring and drawing, then I can get my Copics, which I then ended up getting because my skill got better. But other than that, the markers were really great, and they're still super juicy. Like, I'm using them and I'm like, damn, like, I don't have any problems blending back and forth because the markers are so full of ink, especially because I know that even though I used them a lot, they still held a good amount of ink, which makes sense because the barrels are like huge. The marker barrel itself is a pretty big one, so they are kind of clunkier if you have smaller hands. I, on the other hand, have very large man hands. So holding stuff like that is no problem with me. Sometimes I actually have a harder time gripping onto the Copic markers because they're a little slimmer, so the grip there isn't the same, but the grip on the Spectrum Noirs, yeah, that's a good one. The liners, of course, like I stated before, were still really good. It takes a lot, I feel like, for a liner to really start, like, dying, like, a lot of use, because when I think about it, I only get to use my liners for about 25 minutes max, right? And most of the time, you're not filling up a whole entire area or section, you're just outlining what you're drawing, or sometimes I'll go ahead and do, like, cross-hatching with them and, like, different kinds of styles with black and white art. But for the most part, you know, my liners aren't going to be used as aggressively as my markers are because, again, they're just outlining. So I remember for this paper, I forgot to mention it, that it used to smudge back in the day, right? So whenever I'd put down my liners first and then color it in, it would end up smudging. So what I did here is the same technique that I'm doing now with my current sketchbook, which is coloring in the drawing first and then going in after to ink, so this way the ink from the markers doesn't catch up with the ink from the liners. Also, I wanted to add in, because this is like really fucking weird, right? That I think I started to subconsciously put myself back a few years ago, and I ended up, I guess, shitting myself, because that's what that sounds like. Sorry, we're doing construction at the same time that I'm doing this video. Yippee. But I subconsciously, I think, put myself back a few years ago when I was doing these art supplies because I was feeling nostalgic. And I ended up kind of drawing in the art style that I kind of used to draw in, but just more refined, which is like really weird because I feel like if I look through my current sketchbook versus this sketch right here, they look pretty different from each other. Like even the drawing that I did of this guy in my sketchbook looks different than when it's on this paper, and it's like weird. So I think I subconsciously put my mind back like 3-4 years ago where I had really started doing the drawing. But I mean, like, I'm not mad at it. I just wish it looked a little better because I remember I refined my art style over the years, so this way it didn't look like this as much anymore. But at the same time, it's kind of like endearing because I'm like, wow, I really used to draw like that and it's so different now. So I thought that was weird that my brain did that, and, you know, psychology took over, yippee. But at the same time, it's kind of cool and I kind of enjoy it. At first I hated the drawing, but now I'm like looking at it, I'm like, you know what, man, this kind of warms my heart, I'm not gonna lie. Okay, now back to the art supplies. As you can see here, I'm using the Prismacolor colored pencils, and I've had these colored pencils since, I'm gonna say, my senior year in high school, like for a pretty long while now. And as you can see, a lot of them are still basically brand new. Like a lot of these I don't remember even using, and that's because at some point I stopped doing art because I thought that it would impede on my studies and everything going on, and I was like, you know what, bro, I'm miserable without art, so I went back to it, and then here I am now doing it at least every week, and I'm enjoying my life at least now compared to what it was before. It was very saddening. But besides that point, I am using the colored pencils now in this drawing to help give it out some more detail and to kind of give some colors that the Spectrum Noir markers didn't have, because a lot of the colors are pretty dark and I didn't want to use them in areas that I felt weren't necessary. So those colored pencils came in for like a really nice softer gradient in areas that I wanted it to. It also helped give nice details like to the Argyle sweater and to the hair of the character, along with some nice blush on the cheeks. So there's also that. For the white gel pen, I used to use a Sakura jelly roll, but I hated them. So I ended up selling the ones I had and just buying the Uniball Signos, which is what I ended up using for this drawing too. So I'm definitely a Uniball Signo fan all the way. Sakura jelly rolls just don't work with me. They hate me and I hate them. So yeah. Basically, with all these art supplies and using them all together for this drawing, including the last little bits, which is the Sharpie, just kind of giving the character an outline on the outside and like loosening up some of that white space that's all around him, I ended up really enjoying doing the piece, and I actually got to use the supplies twice, right? Because the first time it wasn't recording. So yeah, I ended up getting way more use out of them than I originally had planned, and I really suggest going back to some of your old art supplies if you have any, and then just kind of using them again with your current art style or the way you do things, and see how, you know, you can use them to your benefit, or at least use them just because you have them and they're waiting to be used. And hey, maybe you'll even get some nostalgia from using them like I did. Maybe I'll use these more often. I'll see. So yeah, thanks for watching, and remember, I love you. Bye.